Imagine you're sitting in a budget meeting and someone puts two options on the table. Option 1 costs $500,000 and completely eliminates one rare software bug that's caused exactly one outage in the last 3 years. Option 2 costs the same $500,000 but reduces 10 common, everyday bugs by 80% each. Bugs that quietly cost the company money every single week. Most rooms, without even discussing the math, will lean toward option 1. That instinct, that pull toward total elimination over partial reduction, even when partial reduction saves more in the long run, is called zero-risk bias, and it might be one of the most expensive blind spots sitting inside your organization's budget right now. Let's start with where this idea actually comes from, because it wasn't invented by a management consultant trying to sell you a framework. It comes out of serious behavioral science. In the 1970s and into the early 1980s, two psychologists, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, were running a series of experiments trying to understand how people actually make decisions under uncertainty, as opposed to how classical economic theory said they should make decisions. Classical theory assumed people were rational actors who weighed expected value, meaning the size of an outcome multiplied by its probability, and picked whichever option produced the best expected number. Kahneman and Tversky kept finding that real people didn't do that. Real people had systematic, predictable, repeatable quirks in how they treated probability. And one of the biggest quirks was this. People place a wildly disproportionate value on moving a risk from some small percentage down to exactly zero, compared to moving a risk down by the same absolute amount if it doesn't reach zero. Cutting a risk from 5% to 0 feels enormously more valuable to people than cutting a risk from 10% to 5%, even though mathematically those are identical 5-point reductions. The 0 mark carries a kind of psychological magic that no other number on the scale carries. This research eventually became part of what's known as prospect theory, which later won Kahneman the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 2002, and it remains one of the most replicated findings in behavioral economics. It's not a fluke. It's not culturally specific. It shows up in lab experiments, in medical decision-making, in insurance purchasing, and yes, in corporate management. So why does this happen? What's actually going on in the brain, or in the org chart, that makes 0 so magnetic? Part of it is emotional accounting. A risk that's been reduced but not eliminated still requires you to hold it in your head. You still have to think about it, monitor it, explain it if it goes wrong. A risk that's been taken to 0, at least in your mind, lets you stop thinking about it entirely. It closes the mental file. There's a satisfying click, a sense of closure that a partial fix simply doesn't deliver, no matter how much total harm that partial fix actually prevents. Another part of it is about how blame and credit get assigned inside organizations. If you spend money reducing 10 problems by 80% each, and one of them still causes an issue next quarter, you will get blamed for the issue that happened, not credited for the 9 that didn't. But if you spend the same money eliminating one problem completely, and that problem never resurfaces, you get a clean, unambiguous win. Nobody can point to it and say, well, it still happens sometimes. 0 risk is the only outcome that can never be second-guessed after the fact. That protects the manager's reputation even when it doesn't protect the company's bottom line, and that's a crucial distinction to sit with for a second, because it means 0 risk bias isn't just a cognitive glitch. It's often a rational response to how performance actually gets evaluated inside a company. If your bosses reward the appearance of total control more than they reward aggregate harm reduction, you will get more 0 risk bias, guaranteed, no matter how many training sessions you run on cognitive biases. Let's walk through where this actually shows up in day-to-day management, because once you see the pattern, you start noticing it everywhere. Take engineering and product teams. A product manager sees a rare crash bug that affects maybe 0.5% of users, but generates a dramatic, visible bug report every time it happens, screenshots and all. Meanwhile, there are 10 smaller usability frictions, slow loading screens, confusing menu labels, a checkout flow with one extra unnecessary click, each individually minor, but collectively costing the company real conversion revenue every day. The rare crash gets a dedicated sprint. The 10 small frictions get deprioritized quarter after quarter, because none of them, individually, feels urgent enough to justify a project. Nobody sits down and calculates that the 10 small frictions, summed together, are costing the company 10 times more revenue than the crash ever did. The crash is dramatic and closable. The frictions are boring and only ever reducible. Now take cybersecurity, because this is maybe the clearest, highest stakes version of the pattern. Security budgets are finite, and security teams constantly have to choose where to spend. Zero-risk bias pushes them toward defending against exotic, headline-grabbing attack vectors, an obscure zero-day exploit, a nation-state-level intrusion technique, something that sounds terrifying in a board presentation and can be described as fully mitigated once the patch goes in. Meanwhile, the boring stuff, password hygiene, multi-factor authentication rollout, patching known vulnerabilities on schedule, employee phishing awareness, stays underfunded and half implemented across the company, because none of those things can ever be declared done. You can implement multi-factor authentication as a policy, but enforcement always leaks. Someone always finds a workaround. It can be reduced to a small residual risk, but it will never hit zero, so it never gets the same emotional payoff as fixing the one exotic vulnerability. And yet, if you look at actual breach data across almost any industry, the overwhelming majority of successful attacks come through the boring channels: compromised passwords, unpatched systems that were known about for months, a single employee clicking a phishing link. The dramatic zero-day exploit that justified the big-budget line item is involved in a small fraction of real incidents. Companies are spending disproportionately to erase the rare threat to zero, while the common, boring threat that causes most of the actual damage stays only partially addressed, year after year. Compliance work follows the exact same shape. Picture a compliance team that has 40 different regulatory obligations to manage across a company's operations. Some of those obligations are narrow and well-defined: a specific data retention rule, a specific labeling requirement, something with a clear checklist that can be fully satisfied and certified. Others are broad and messy: general data governance quality, cross-departmental training consistency, vendor risk management across hundreds of third parties, things that can only ever be improved, never fully finished, because the scope keeps shifting and new vendors keep getting added. Compliance teams under pressure will often pour disproportionate effort into the narrow items, chasing full certification, 100% checkbox completion, a clean audit on that one specific rule, while the broad, messy risks, the ones that actually generate the biggest regulatory and reputational exposure when they go wrong, get managed at some vague, partial, good enough for now level indefinitely. The narrow rule gives you a certificate to hang on the wall. The broad risk never gives you that satisfaction, so it perpetually loses the internal argument for more resources, even when it's genuinely more dangerous. You see it in manufacturing and physical safety programs too, which is a useful example because the stakes are visible in a way spreadsheet risk usually isn't. A plant might spend a huge chunk of its annual safety budget installing an elaborate fail-safe system around one specific piece of machinery that has caused a single serious injury in company history, an injury dramatic enough that everyone remembers it, maybe even one that made local news. That machine gets guards, sensors, lockout systems, redundant shutoffs, the works, until the probability of a repeat incident on that exact machine is essentially zero. Meanwhile, the plant's slip and fall rate from wet floors near the loading dock, its repetitive strain injury rate from poorly adjusted workstations, and its minor laceration rate from unguarded hand tools across a dozen other stations continue at a steady, unglamorous pace, month after month, generating far more total injuries, far more workers' comp claims, and far more lost workdays than the one dramatic machine ever did, even in the years before it got fixed. Nobody holds a ribbon-cutting ceremony for "we reduced minor slip incidents by 60% across the facility." Everybody remembers and talks about "we fixed the machine that hurt Dave." The dramatic, nameable, zero-able risk wins the budget fight nearly every time, regardless of what the injury log actually says when you tally it up at year-end. Hiring and staffing decisions carry a quieter version of the same bias. A hiring manager worried about making one catastrophically bad hire, someone who turns out to be dishonest, disruptive, or actively harmful to the team, will sometimes build an interview process so exhaustive, so many rounds, so many reference checks, so many committee sign-offs that it's specifically engineered to drive the odds of that one nightmare scenario as close to zero as humanly possible. That's a reasonable goal in isolation. But the same process, stretched out over 8 or 10 weeks with 6 or 7 interview rounds, quietly costs the company its best candidates along the way. The strong performers who simply can't wait 2 months and take a competing offer instead, and it costs hiring managers real productivity. Every week, the seat sits empty. Add up the lost candidates and the lost weeks of unfilled capacity across a whole year of hiring, and the aggregate cost of over-engineering against the rare bad hire often exceeds what a single bad hire would have cost the team directly, even accounting for the disruption a genuinely bad hire causes. Nobody tracks that lost aggregate cost as a single line item, so it never triggers a redesign the way one visible hiring disaster would. Here's an important nuance though, because none of this means you should ignore small risks, or that eliminating a risk to zero is always the wrong call. Sometimes zero really is the right target. If a risk carries a catastrophic, irreversible consequence, a plane crash, a chemical spill, a data breach involving miners, then the math genuinely changes, because the cost of even one occurrence is so enormous that it can dwarf the expected value math you'd normally apply. Some risks have what's sometimes called fat-tailed consequences, where the worst-case outcome is so severe that averaging it against probability understates how much it actually deserves attention. A rare bug that occasionally deletes a customer's entire financial records is not directly comparable to 10 common bugs that each cost a few minutes of user frustration, even if the expected value math says otherwise on paper, because human trust, once catastrophically broken, doesn't repair linearly. So the fix here isn't always spread your budget evenly and never fully close anything. The fix is being honest about which risks are genuinely catastrophic and irreversible, where full elimination earns its keep, versus which risks are merely uncomfortable and reducible, where the emotional pull towards zero is doing the actual deciding instead of the math. There's also a second, subtler nuance worth naming, which is that zero-risk projects sometimes carry real strategic value, even when the raw expected value math looks unfavorable, because eliminating a risk entirely can free up attention and mental bandwidth elsewhere. A team that no longer has to think about a recurring category of failure at all can redirect that freed-up focus toward growth work instead of firefighting, and that redirected focus has its own value that doesn't show up cleanly in a damage-avoided spreadsheet. So the honest version of this isn't zero-risk fixes are always wasteful. It's zero-risk fixes get chosen far more often than their actual value justifies because the emotional payoff is so consistent and so immediate, while the value of freed-up attention is inconsistent and has to be deliberately captured rather than assumed. If you're going to justify a zero-risk project on attention-freeing grounds, say so explicitly and be ready to show what that freed attention actually got redirected towards 6 months later. Otherwise, it's just the bias wearing a more sophisticated argument. So what does a manager actually do differently starting Monday morning? The first move is to build the habit of ranking risks by total expected damage, which means probability multiplied by severity, summed across everything on your list, not by how emotionally satisfying each fix would feel once it's done. Before you approve a project whose entire pitch is, "This will completely eliminate this one risk," force yourself to ask a second question out loud in the room. What else could this same budget reduce instead, even partially, across other risks on our list? Write both numbers down side by side. Often, when you actually do that math honestly, the answer that reduces 5 different risks by 60% each prevents more total harm across the business than the answer that erases one risk down to zero, and it's not particularly close. The second move is to change how you reward your team. If you only ever praise the clean, closed, fully solved problem in your team meetings and never acknowledge the person who quietly reduced 10 annoying issues by 70% without fanfare, you are training your best people to chase zero-risk projects, specifically because that's what gets noticed, regardless of what actually serves the company. Start explicitly naming and rewarding aggregate harm reduction, not just clean closures. The third move is simply building a standing habit, maybe quarterly, of listing out every risk sitting on your team's radar with a rough severity and probability next to each one, so that when a shiny, "let's fully fix this one thing" proposal comes across your desk, you have an actual comparison chart sitting right there, instead of relying on gut feeling in the moment. Gut feeling, as we now know from decades of research, is reliably biased towards zero. And the only real antidote to a reliable bias is a deliberate, repeatable process that doesn't depend on remembering to be rational in the moment. There's a fourth move worth mentioning too, which is training yourself to notice the specific language that signals zero-risk bias creeping into a room. Phrases like, "We can finally close this out," "This makes the problem go away for good," or "We'll never have to worry about this again," should function as a trigger, not a green light. They're not proof the proposal is wrong, but they're proof the emotional argument is doing more work in the conversation than the numerical one, and that's exactly the moment to slow down and ask for the comparison chart. The same goes for the reverse signal, when someone dismisses a proposal because it doesn't fully solve the problem, as though partial improvement were somehow disqualifying. A 60% reduction across 5 real recurring risks is not a consolation prize. It is very often the single highest value thing on the table, and it deserves to be pitched, funded, and celebrated with exactly as much enthusiasm as the clean, dramatic fix gets, even though it will never come with a tidy finish line to point to. Building a team culture where meaningfully better is treated as genuinely worth celebrating, not just completely solved, is probably the single most durable fix available to a manager, because it changes what your best people choose to work on before a single budget meeting ever happens. Risk management done well isn't about how many problems you can cross off a list with a satisfying line through them. It's about how much total damage never happens across your entire operation, whether that came from one dramatic fix or 10 unglamorous improvements nobody will ever throw a party for. The next time a proposal crosses your desk, promising to make one small problem completely disappear, ask what the same money could have done spread across everything else, and let me know in the comments what the most tempting zero-risk trap you've seen inside your own company actually was.